Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Welcome back to the Mosin Museum. We're coming up here on the 3rd anniversary of the Ukraine War. And this is probably the most important war that's ever occurred in my lifetime. And if it doesn't turn out a certain way, it could prove to be the most important war in world history. Which is why I wanted to make this video, because there's been a recent inauguration of a new president of the United States. And with that, I think it harkens back to a forgotten area of American and world history. And if we're not careful, we're going to overlook it. And there's a lesson here that I think we could learn that actually might help end this war. So in order to understand that, we need to take a look at this rifle here. This is a model 1891 Mosin Nagant, produced in 1894 by the Sestrets Arms Arsenal just outside of St. Petersburg. This is an interesting gun because it has a marking on it, which we're going to get to. But in order to understand the history of this gun, we're going to take a quick step back in time to the 1870s in Japan. You see, Japan was coming out of the feudal era, and they were in what was called the Meiji Restoration, where they finally decided to welcome with open arms modern technology, science, and industry. And in a span of less than 40 years, Japan went from a hermit nation full of sword-wielding samurais to a modern industrial powerhouse with one of the most formidable navies the world had ever seen. And coming out of this, one of the things that they were interested in was territorial expansion. Hence, we have the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894. And this is a really important war because it really started to show the entire world that Japan was not somebody that you want to mess with. The main area of focus in that war was expanding their influence in Korea and the Liaodong Peninsula in China. And while they were successful in the former, the latter not quite so much, because Germany, France, and Russia forced Japan to sign the Liaodong Peninsula back over to China. However, Russia at this time was also really interested in expanding its influence into Manchuria. And the Japanese weren't too happy with the fact that after this war, Russia then leased the Liaodong Peninsula from China and built a huge naval base in Port Arthur. Japan was infuriated by this, as you could imagine. So roughly 10 years later, fast forward to 1904, we have a surprise attack by the Japanese Navy on Port Arthur in a sort of similar style to what you would see in Pearl Harbor around 35 years later, minus the planes and Japanese eras, of course. This is a really important conflict because this is how we get this rifle here today. We have the Russo-Japanese War. Some people call it World War Zero. And when we think of the Russo-Japanese War, we think of the siege at Port Arthur, and we really think of naval battles, especially the infamous Battle of Tsushima, where in a single battle, the Japanese Navy sunk almost the entirety of the Russian Baltic Fleet. But we also don't think about so much, especially here in the West, about the land battle aspect of the Russo-Japanese War. Take the Battle of Mukden, for instance. This was basically one of the largest land battles the world had ever seen, with over 600,000 troops. You had really the first modern war with barbed wire. Both telegraph and telephones were used, as well as machine guns. And there was this huge spar between there was basically a shared conflict between Russia and Japan, because they both wanted to basically have their influence spread throughout all of Manchuria and Korea. All right, and neither were really interested in backing down, and neither really needed to, because they both had completely formidable military forces with these modern adaptations to machine guns. Hundreds of thousands of men were just cut down. The world had never seen anything like this before, and the conflict was really starting to spiral out of control. The West was really starting to get a lot of anxiety about this and, didn't want to have to step in and even cause a larger global conflict, although it was sort of looking like that. And Russia was having some problems, and a new revolution was about to go down, and it almost took down the Tsar, in fact. And as this kept going on for almost a year, Japan was about to run out of money. This was a very, very bad situation because it was sort of like a bull was unleashed in a china shop, and nobody really knew how to end this or what to do. And as time went on, everybody around the world knew this was only going to get worse. So let's pause for a second. How did the Russo-Japanese War come to a conclusion? Well, it was actually due to America. You've probably heard of one man named Teddy Roosevelt. He actually has a lot of history right here in Colorado. You see that mountain behind me there? That's actually Roosevelt National Forest. You could probably guess who that's named after. You see this highway going up here was actually built in the 30s, but below that, following this little creek, there was an old road that Mr. Stanley, who built the Stanley steamer and the Stanley Hotel, he funded this road in 1907 because the Stanley steamer at the time was the only car that could add enough torque to get up the hill to Estes Park. Teddy Roosevelt once famously rode on that road up to the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is Teddy Roosevelt's trip to Colorado in May of 1905. You see, Teddy Roosevelt was a bit of a hunter, as most people were aware of. Now, he had this persona and aura about him that was renowned around the world. He was the man that led the famous Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War. And of course, he was famously shot and still finished his speech much later in 1912. But even before then, people knew the type of man he was. He had a lot of grit. He was not the sort of person to really ever want to give up on anything. And he's also sort of one of those people that, you sort of just don't want to mess with. He just said things like they were. Remind you of anybody? Maybe a president, another president? Hold that thought. In May of 1905, Teddy Roosevelt came through Denver on the Santa Fe Railroad to Glenwood Springs, where he went on a bear hunt. And he would stay at the Colorado Hotel in Glenwood Springs. And on this trip, he was famous for supposedly helping to invent the teddy bear, because apparently for several days he had terrible rotten luck and got really down that he couldn't find a bear. And so the rumor goes that a bunch of maids at the Hotel Colorado put some scraps together and put what looked like a bear on his bed when he got back. Thus, the teddy bear was born. However, this was not nearly the most consequential thing that happened on this trip. You see, around May of 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, like we talked about, was really coming to a boil. And while he was away, he basically left Secretary of War William Howard Taft in charge in Washington. Well, on his trip, he got a telegraph from William Howard Taft about the Russo-Japanese War, and that he really should be the guy to lead peace talks. And I think everybody around the world kind of knew that Teddy Roosevelt might be the only man that could end this war. Russia knew it, America knew it, and Japan knew it. Interestingly enough, Roosevelt had at least one very powerful diplomatic contact in Japan that also went to Harvard. So there were some interesting connections there. But regardless, we sort of knew that if anyone was going to end this war, it had to be President Roosevelt. And so he had to leave his trip, go back to Washington, and get this all figured out. And thus, we had the Treaty of Portsmouth, where the envoys of Japan and Russia were invited to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and a peace deal was hashed out. And this gun is a reminder of that. It has this really fascinating marking here on the stock, which says, basically it translates in Japanese, property of Imperial Japanese Quartermaster Liaodong Company on the Liaodong Peninsula. How this rifle got here is anybody's guess. Maybe it came back from the Korean War. It's a time capsule, and it really shouldn't exist. We don't really know how this gun managed to survive in its state for over 120 years. It's really crazy. But if it wasn't for this gun, maybe we wouldn't even be talking about this today. The Russo-Japanese War is not something we talk about a lot here in the West, even though, interestingly enough, here in America, we helped broker the peace deal and saved a countless number of lives in the process. Now, this is really important because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we have a similar conflict going on in Ukraine right now. We have also a new president, and our President Donald Trump, in a lot of ways, has a lot of similarities to President Theodore Roosevelt. He's a man of true grit, and he really showed this to the world when he was shot in the ear back in July of last year, and he got up and chanted, "Fight, fight, fight." That really showed the world who Donald Trump truly was. In his first term, people didn't really want to mess with him because they were just kind of scared that he was some madman. And his second term, people don't want to mess with him because they really genuinely know who he is, and they know that they don't really want to mess with him. So, what does all this boil down to? Well, we're in a similar situation here. The world knows that the only person that can broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine is President Donald Trump. So, in Donald Trump's first term, he called the Abraham Accords, which helped to bring peace, at least for a little while, to the Middle East, and nobody thought that could be done. Well, now, in 2025, I'm calling on President Donald Trump to institute the Portsmouth Accords. Let's invite delegations from Ukraine and Russia to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the spirit of when we helped broker a peace deal for a very nasty war, and in the spirit of when relations between the West and Russia were in a little bit better place than they are today. President Donald Trump is the only man that can end this war, and I pray that that's exactly what happens, because we got to end this killing, folks. Please pray for peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Let me know if you guys have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.